as we say every time, Mike, Mark, Rod and myself have been preaching through the book of Mark for some months now, and if you really want the statistics of how many sermons we had and when we started, you'll have to ask Mike. But for the first 8 chapters, the first half of the book, Mark tells us about the messianic authority of Jesus. He details his mighty acts. He casts out demons, he heals the sick, he raises the dead, so that by the end of chapter 8, no honest inquirer could have any doubt at all about the authority of Jesus, about his kingship, that he was the Messiah. And Peter indeed confesses, "You are the Messiah," in chapter 8. But from then on, in the following chapters, the narrative changes dramatically. Jesus begins to predict that his messianic role and purpose was not what the disciples were expecting. He had not come to conquer the Roman legions and institute a new earthly kingdom. His role was not to restore the fortunes of the nation to its former glories, ushering in a time of peace and prosperity and make Israel great again. He'd come to defeat Satan, sin and death as the suffering Messiah. And we're so used to this story about the crucifixion that we think nothing surprising about it. But for Jews and Gentiles in the first century, it made no sense at all. In fact, it was a stumbling block that this Messiah, who the Christians claimed to be the saviour of the world, had suffered the most horrific and shameful death, Roman crucifixion. Yet Mark's narrative was written to show that actually all along this was God's purpose and plan. It was through Jesus' suffering and death that Jesus would bring salvation to his people. He was indeed the mighty Messiah, the Son of God, and this was confirmed not just by his acts of power and authority, but also by his sufferings and death. And this is what Mike brought out last week when he covered the passage about the crucifixion. We're looking on what happened afterwards, but Mike covered, and he made some points last week about the crucifixion, and if you haven't listened to it, it'd be well worth you listening to it. He said, it is a story that we know, or at least think we know, so well that we become immune to its power. And he brought out 3 themes, paradoxes if you like, each in their own way glorifying Jesus. Glory and shame. Despite the humiliation and shame of the cross, the crucifixion displayed and evidenced the glory of Jesus. Strength and weakness. Despite Jesus' apparent weakness on the cross, his mighty power and strength was evident through it all. Despite suffering not simply physical torment, he bore the wrath of God, and despite the appearances of divine dereliction, his faith never wavers. And finally, human responsibility and divine sovereignty. Side by side, without any contradiction, we saw the terrible responsibility of those who plotted, purposed and carried out the humiliation and execution of Jesus. And yet through it all, God's purposes were completely fulfilled. Now, this morning, Mike had us read for us the whole of the section, but we will be starting in verse 40. And in this we pick up a different theme, where the focus shifts not so much on Jesus, but to those who are left behind, and what they did and how they behaved. Now, of course, from our vantage point, we know the full story, but we have to remember that they did not. They had witnessed that terrible event. The Messiah had been slain by the enemies, and the forces of darkness had triumphed. That is all they knew. And yet we see in their actions the display of remarkable faith. So if you want a title to this story, to this sermon, Faith When the Lights Go Out. I'll recount to you a sort of relevant story, and if you're a C.S. Lewis fan, I think you'll be with me. If not, just bear with me. In The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, 4 children find their way through a magical wardrobe into a land called Narnia. And it is a land of perpetual cold, ice and snow, but never Christmas. And is under the spell of an evil witch. And then they hear the rumours of a coming saviour, the true ruler of the land, Aslan, the great lion, the son of the emperor over the sea, who has come to free the land from tyranny, from evil and slavery. Eventually, 3 of them are met with Aslan, but one of the children betrays them all, and Aslan has to go And he goes to the side of the witch, and learning what he has done, he tries to change sides again. He wants to be free, but he cannot. And the only way for him to be freed is for an innocent victim to take his place, to die the death he should have died. And this is precisely what Aslan does. He freely gives himself and his life for Edmund. The story tells how he's bound and mocked and humiliated by the evil queen before being killed. And before he dies, we read this. It tells about the queen came to kill him. At last she drew near. She stood by Aslan's head. Her face was working and twitching with passion. But he looked up at the sky, still quiet, neither angry nor afraid, but a little sad. Then just before the blow she gave, she stooped down and said in a quivering voice, "And now, who has won? Fool, do you think that by all this you would save the human traitor? Now I will kill you instead of him, and justice will be appeased. But when you are dead, that will not prevent me killing him as well. And who will deliver him out of my hand then? Understand that you have given me Narnia forever. You have lost your own life, and you have not saved his. In that knowledge, despair and die." And that is almost the position we're in at the end of the crucifixion. Of course, in this story, we know it doesn't end here, and I'm not going to tell it you, and if you want to find out, you'll have to read it for yourself. But if we placed ourselves in the position of the disciples after the crucifixion, the situation that they were in would appear just as bleak. Evil had won, and that good, the greatest good, had been defeated. This was the apparent situation to those who trusted in Jesus, those who believed and followed him. Now, yesterday, 21st of December, was actually officially the darkest day, or the shortest day, whatever you call it. But this was the darkest day in human history. Evil had won. The Son of God had been slain in cold blood. And whatever hopes those who trusted in him had held were now all gone. It was night, absolute darkness. His followers, and there were many, those who believed in him, had thought that only a few days before that the triumph of the Messiah was imminent. He would save Israel and his people. He would restore the glory of the former nation. And now their hopes, their dreams were shattered, destroyed. The one they had trusted in, worshipped and followed had been killed, and the enemies had triumphed. For most, their faith was not simply shaken, but beyond crisis. They were overtaken with fear and fled and hid. Now, it's true that if they had fully understood what Jesus had tried to tell them about the true nature of his mission, they would have realised that things were actually going all to plan. But few, if any, understood this. And perhaps even if they had kind of listened to what Jesus was saying, it would have seemed so almost unbelievable that good could still come. And one of those things that we've covered in Mark is this dichotomy of faith and unbelief. Throughout it, we see brazen unbelief from those of great religious privilege and contrasted with almost inexplicable faith in those who, against all odds, trust in Jesus. And this is what Jesus shows us in this, Mark shows us in this passage before us. On the darkest of days, when all hopes and dreams had been destroyed, we have the example of disciples, followers of Jesus, whose faith simply shines. They are largely unknown, of little significance, and disappear when their task is done. They were ordinary people, like us, who would never have considered themselves to be of great faith, and perhaps other people didn't consider themselves to be of faith either. But we see by their actions now that they were of great faith, and they rise to the occasion and they perform bold and fearless actions. Ironically, those who would have considered, and the church would have considered, the great Christians of the day, who less than 24 hours had protested their unswerving loyalty to Jesus, how much they loved him and how much they would never disown him, their action proved it. Despite all appearances, they ran away. They disowned him. And these, they carried on. They did what was needed, serving Jesus in the only way they knew how. So if we look in the passage, we see there are kind of two groups of people. Very simple, the men and the women. So first of all, we'll consider the second group first. And not because there's any sort of question of superiority of men and women. It's just, I'd like to finish with the women because it's more inspiring. It's the preparation day. That is the day before the Sabbath. So as evening approached, Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of the council, who also himself was waiting for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Pilate was surprised to hear that he was already dead. Summoning the centurion, he asked if Jesus had already died. When he learned from the centurion that it was so, he gave the body to Joseph. So Joseph brought some linen cloth, took down the body, wrapped it in the linen, and placed it in a tomb cut out of the rock. Then he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. So, where we start in our narrative, so we're jumping a bit from the very first verse of what I'm covering, 42. Evening was drawing in, and Mark reminds us that the following day would be the Sabbath. The term preparation just simply designates any day prior to a festival or the Sabbath, and in this instance it just meant the Friday, which would have ended at sunset. And we read of a certain disciple, Joseph, a man from a small village about 20 miles northwest of Jerusalem. And he was a much respected member of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council, but he was someone who had not been part in the proceeding against Jesus. But he was someone who believed in and looked for the nation's messianic hope. And he has the courage to step up and ask for permission to bury the body of Jesus. And he is actually the only one who is able to do it. He's the only one with the resources or ability to do so. Normally it should have been a friend or family, but the disciples had all fled, and there was no evidence of any of his family, his brothers being in the city, and his mother had no means to do it. Roman law dictated that the loss of all honours and even the right to burial was forfeit when someone was executed by crucifixion. And often the corpse would lie on the cross, would be left there to rot or to be eaten by birds or animals. And the release of the corpse actually depended on the generosity of the magistrate, in this case Pilate. And Pilate is astounded that Jesus is already dead, but checks with the officiating centurion, who informs him that Jesus was indeed dead. Now Joseph's request was courageous, bold and risky. Even though Jesus had been crucified for high treason, and had no obvious connection with Jesus, he still boldly petitions Pilate for the right to bury Jesus. And his request is daring because he was effectively making it quite and very public, his loyalty and commitment to, in the eyes of the Roman government, a criminal. And in this act we see the faith of Joseph and those who were with him, men who hitherto we have heard nothing of, who were not prominent disciples, and they displayed no extraordinary faith, zeal or commitment. In fact, they're quite the opposite. They are secret disciples and have been up to this point. They're now bold and courageous. And in the Gospel of John we hear of Nicodemus, who describes him there, who when he first met Jesus wouldn't come to him in the daytime but came to him in dark at night. And out of nowhere, in this most depressing and hopeless situation, they display extraordinary faith. And their faith is not something which is simply an academic belief. It is a faith which is steeped in love. All his resources were used for Jesus. And we read, whatever influence he has is used to acquire the body for burial. And whatever the cost to his reputation, wealth or safety, he takes it. He donates his family tomb, a tomb cut out of the bedrock, which would by its description be a fine and very expensive one to build. And it was intended not just for him, but for his whole family, but he freely gives it to Jesus. He lovingly has the body washed and wrapped in fine linen cloth. And we read elsewhere that 100 pounds, nearly 100 weight of ointment was used to anoint the body. And at the end, when they had placed it in the tomb, a huge disc-shaped stone was rolled in front of the entrance. We see here devotion and love. Without love for Jesus, our faith and our hope are nothing. I remember hearing a discussion from John Piper, and he was commenting on something R.C. Sproul had mentioned describing what faith was. And he described it, an example I'm sure you've all heard before. It's like a chair. And when we have faith in the chair, because we have confidence that when we sit down on that chair, it will hold us. And that describes the act of faith we have in that chair. But Piper says something extra. He said, there is something more to it than that. There is love involved. It's almost saying you not only trust that chair, but you love that chair. And so it was here that despite their hurt, the midnight of their souls, they were not preoccupied with themselves, their feelings, their grief, but did what they knew was necessary and displayed their love and devotion openly to all. They should have been fearful, because if their master had been killed, then sooner or later it would come to them. They were people who had much to lose. They were wealthy, they were respected, they had influence and reputation, and yet they were bold and willing to risk everything for Jesus. God at that time had given them the faith they needed. And the most, ironically, fearless of all the apostles had denied Jesus and fled. And here they were. The second group of people, the women. Some women were watching from a distance. Among them was Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the younger and of Joseph, and Salome. In Galilee, these people had followed him and cared for his needs. Many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem were also there. And then in verse 47, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of Joseph saw where he was. So the answer to you, Mike, is if you had used the more recent version of the NIV, you wouldn't have had that problem. So we read how a group of women, disciples from Galilee, had followed and supported and served Jesus for the last 3 years. And what did they do? They seemed being able to do anything. They just watched. They just kept vigil. And there appeared to be a number of them, and they would have included Mary, the mother of Jesus, who there had witnessed her own son being crucified, powerless to comfort or help him. Mark makes special mention of 3. There's Mary Magdalene, or Mary from Magdala, a small village in the west side of Galilee. And in the Gospels, she is the most prominent of the women disciples of Jesus, usually mentioned first when they are mentioned. We're told elsewhere that Jesus cast 7 demons from her, and she was the first to be privileged to see him after the resurrection. The other Mary we don't know much of, but her sons appear to be well known in the early church. And Salome was the wife of Zebedee, the mother of James and John. And so while others had fled, they stayed. They were kept going by faith. And you see the strength of their faith, the determination it generated. Despite their grief, they did not fall into despair or become paralysed into inaction. They deliberately and purposely kept no to the burial site because they knew that they needed what they needed to do next. They rested the Sabbath as God had commanded their nation to do so. And when the Sabbath was finished, they bought spices to perform their last act of devotion. So as soon as it was daybreak on the Sunday morning, they were going to go and fulfill their purpose. Now, what might not appear remarkable to us is the space that Mark gives and the prominence Mark gives to the women. In the first century, particularly in Jewish religious society, there was one rabbi who said that he thanked God that he was not made a Gentile, a slave, or a woman. And it's quite shocking to know that even certain strict religious Jewish sects, they have one of their prayers in the morning where, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who has not created me a woman." So you kind of get the impression that this is almost unthinkable. But Mark gives many examples of women in his book, his narrative. We hear of the woman with the issue of blood who with great faith is commended by Jesus. We hear the Syrophoenician woman who has her son cured. We hear the woman who anoints his feet with the ointment. Here we see the unimportant, the humble, those who even the disciples looked on, because actually, if you remember, when the disciples were met by the women explaining what they'd seen, they wouldn't take any notice of them. And these are elevated and singled out for devotion to Jesus. They were rewarded in their devotion because they were the first to witness the resurrection. So in conclusion, I'm sure this was not the sermon you were expecting this morning, but 3 points to go away with. God uses the smallest and most insignificant of people. Most of us here perhaps are only too aware of how defective and weak our faith is, that our devotion to Jesus is not what it should be, and we don't love him as much as he deserves. And we recognise that perhaps if others also had the same judgment, they would certainly be right. We recognise that we need him, but we also recognise that God uses the most insignificant of people, those whose faith is weak and lack boldness. And that boldness will come at times when God sees fit. That faith will shine in a blaze of glory. Now, we're not called to do extraordinary things, but we are called to be faithful. And they were ready and present to do so. Whatever God had ready for them, no matter how small or futile, those ladies were there ready to do it. Faith when all around is dark. Faith when the lights go out. We live in a dark world, and as individuals, some more than others, some go through periods of great darkness. And this, what we've read about, was indeed a dark day, something we will never go through, because however bad our situation appears to be, we will know that Jesus is there. The one who lived and died has risen, never to die again. He is alive forevermore. But we can learn from these ladies, from the faith of those we have read about, two things. First of all, what did they do? They were together. They could have all gone their separate ways. They could have all grieved in private. They could have all sought solitude and space from others. But they worked together. They served together. They kept together. Today we're quite accustomed to the concept of the pietistic and personal Christian. Christians who see no need for the fellowship of others, for church worship or the church community. But that is not the Christianity of the New Testament church. And the more we absent ourselves from the fellowship of other Christians, the less we will actually want it. And the more distant and disengaged from the church community we become, the less we will want it, and we will suffer for it. Martin Luther, the great reformer, was a man who actually personally suffered greatly from depression. But he said this: "Shun solitude. Eve got into trouble when she walked in the garden alone. I have my worst temptations when I am by myself. Seek out some Christian brother, some wise counsellor. Undergird yourself with the fellowship of the church." Look to Jesus. Remember that their focus was not on themselves or their feelings, their hurt or their grief. It was on Jesus. And their basis for their fellowship was not their grief, but Jesus, of what they could do for him on him alone. And it's something we need to be reminded of, that despite our differences, whatever might divide us, and more importantly, whatever we think we might have in common, as a church, a group of people who follow Jesus, it is our loyalty and our devotion to our common Saviour that is the source of what unites us. If we are relying on anything else, no matter how good, we've put out something before Jesus. In short, we've committed idolatry. A final point: this faith is a gift from God. The question remains, and sometimes we might ask it ourselves, what would I do in that situation? What would I do if my faith was being tried? I recognise my faith is weak in untroubled times. What would I do when I have a real trial? Now, those who actually were confident in their faith, ironically, did not go through. And those who would have considered themselves weak in this story shone. Cornelia, or Corrie ten Boom, was a Dutch watchmaker. In fact, she was one of the first admitted to the Guild of Watchmaking in Holland in the early 20s and 30s. During the war, she harboured hundreds of Jews with her family amid the Nazi Holocaust to protect them from arrest. And it's believed that her and her family's efforts saved nearly 800 lives. But eventually she was betrayed by a fellow Dutch citizen, and the whole family was imprisoned. In fact, they weren't just simply imprisoned, her and her sister were sent to Ravensbrück, which was the largest concentration camp, the only one for women in Germany. And she survived, but her sister died in that ordeal. She told a story in an autobiographical memoir called The Hiding Place, which was actually subsequently made into a film. And then she became a worldwide Christian speaker, travelled around the world as a public speaker. When she was, during the time of the war, she was very anxious about the future, what would happen to them. And she spoke to her father about this. And she recounts, "Father sat down on the edge of the narrow bed. 'Corrie,' he began gently, 'when you and I go to Amsterdam, when do I give you your ticket?' I sniffed a few times and considered this. 'Why, just before we get on the train?' Sorry. Exactly. And our wise Father in heaven knows when we're going to need things too. Don't run out ahead of him, Corrie. When the time comes that some of us will have to die, you will look into your heart and find the strength you need just in time." Shall we sing our final hymn, which is hymn number 124?